What are the main components of ADO.NET? Here you can see the simplest diagram of the ADO.NET architecture. First important component is dataset. Okay, a dataset is basically a container which gets the data from the one or more table from the database. Okay, it follows disconnected architecture. The next component is data adapter class. A data adapter bridges the gap between the disconnected data tables, objects, and the physical database. So basically, data adapter fills the data sets with the data from the database. That is data adapter. Then the next important component is data reader class. A data reader class allows you to read the data returned by a select command. Okay, it is just read only. Unlike dataset, we cannot update the database via the data readers. Okay, it follows this connected architecture. So that's it. This is the simple answer of this question. What is connected architecture and disconnected architecture? Here is the diagram of the disconnected architecture. You can see we are getting and inserting the data in the disconnected architecture with the help of data adapter. So disconnected architecture means you do not need to connect always to get the data from the database. You can get the data into the data adapter, manipulate the data adapter, and resubmit the data to the database via the data adapter. So it is basically a fast and robust technique, and you do not have to be always like in the connected mode with the database. So that's why we call it disconnected architecture. Whereas if you look at the connected architecture diagram, see, this is directly fetching the data. Now connected architecture means you are directly interacting with the database, but it is less secure and not robust, as it is not able to do updates and very fast, right? Now great, why it is not robust? Because if the connection is lost, then all your data like the update, the insert will go. So it is not a very good technique. Disconnected architecture is better than connected architecture. What are the different execute methods of ADO.NET? Here is the diagram which is showing 3 kinds of execute methods we have in ADO.NET. So execute methods mean basically when we perform some operation from our server to database, then there are some methods which are capable of doing that. So first is execute scalar method. It is used to return single value from the database. Okay, execute scalar. Then second is execute non-query method. It returns a result set from the database which can have multiple values, and it is also used to insert, update, and delete data from the database. That is execute non-query. And the last one is execute reader. It only retrieves the data from the database. No update, no insert. It is read only. So this is like the basic idea of the execute methods of the ADO.NET. What are the authentication techniques used to connect to SQL Server? So basically when we connect our application with SQL Server database, then we use some authentication mechanism, right, to connect to the database. So these are the types of authentication mechanism by which you can connect your server to the SQL Server. Okay. First one is, now we will see the details. First one is Windows authentication. This technique uses your current Windows user account to authenticate to to SQL Server. Now it is the most secured and recommended technique for applications running on the Windows domain. Okay, so if you are running application in Linux, then that is not possible. Here you can see the setting Windows authentication in configuration file for connection string. Here this integrated security equal to true parameter. If you will do this, if you will put this, then it will enable the Windows authentication for the connection for your SQL Server connection. Okay. Then the second popular technique is SQL Server authentication. This technique uses a SQL Server user account and password to authenticate to the SQL Server. And this is the most popular technique for web applications. Okay. See the configuration setting here. Here the application will use the specified user ID and password to SQL. This is the password and user of the SQL server, like the of the user to connect to the SQL server. Okay. And the last one is Azure Active Directory authentication. This technique allows for authentication using Azure Active Directory, okay, identities. So basically, if you are familiar with the Azure, if your application is hosted in Azure Cloud, then mostly we use this Azure Active Directory authentication only. But otherwise, if you have some in-house servers, then we use Windows authentication or SQL Server authentication. But now you know all the authentication techniques used to connect to SQL Server, right? What is ORM? What are the different types of ORM? Here you can see we have one web application which is using the ORM framework to connect to the database. So ORM stands for Object Relational Mapping, and it is used for mapping objects in your application with the database tables. So mapping basically to your application object in your application with the database, that is ORM. It is like a wrapper to make database calls simple and easy, right? And other option we have to connect to the database is ADO.NET in .NET Framework, but ORM is like a wrapper over it. With ORMs like Entity Framework, you have to write less code as comparison to the ADO.NET. And here are the types of ORM we have for .NET: Entity Framework and Hibernate and Dapper. Entity Framework is the one which is mostly used, and we will talk about it more in upcoming questions. What is Entity Framework? Here are few points about Entity Framework. An Entity Framework is an open source ORM from Microsoft. Very short definition. Okay, open source ORM from Microsoft. And another point is like it's like a wrapper over ADO.NET. The next point is Entity Framework minimizes the coding effort by providing relational data in the form of domain-specific objects. So for example, here you can see your student address and branch classes, right? These classes will be directly matched with the database table with the help of Entity Framework only. Okay, the tables in the database, the mapping will happen automatically. The properties of these classes will be like the table columns after the Entity Framework will allow the mapping. So Entity Framework help in maintaining the entity relationship with the tables in the database. How will you differentiate ADO.NET from Entity Framework? Let's see the example of ADO.NET code and its call to the database. See, this is the ADO.NET code to get the result from the TBL users table. You can count the number of lines of code here, right? And now I will show you the code of the Entity Framework for the same thing. And see, here it is. See the difference? Same work has been done in so less code. Now you know in big application how many database calls are there, right? And how many lines of codes can be reduced if you will use Entity Framework approach for all of them, right? So now we will see the differences. In Entity Framework, code is simple and shorter. In ADO.NET, same code is bigger and more complex for the same task to do. Okay. Second difference is Entity Framework can generate SQL statements automatically based on LINQ queries. Okay, that's why its code is it's very short. Whereas ADO.NET requires developers to write SQL statement themselves. So internally you have to write all the things. Okay, the coder has to. Next difference is Entity Framework is designed to be the database independent, which means same code can work with different databases. Okay, not just SQL Server, same code for different databases. Whereas in case of ADO.NET, it is tightly coupled to SQL Server, and if you want to connect with Oracle or any other database, then it requires different code for different database system. That is also a difference, right? And that is advantage of Entity Framework. The next difference and difference is Entity Framework is slightly slower than ADO.NET because internally Entity Framework uses ADO.NET only, and Therefore, ADO.NET is slightly faster than Entity Framework, because Entity Framework is like a wrapper, right? And if you write the ADO.NET code very perfectly, then it might be slightly better in performance than Entity Framework. So first three are the advantages of the Entity Framework, but last one is the advantage of the ADO.NET. How Entity Framework works, or how to set up Entity Framework. Alright, this is a practical question which nobody will ask, but we should know what is the process for setting up Entity Framework. Okay, suppose we have a task, how to add records to student table in database using Entity Framework. First step is to install Entity Framework package, NuGet package, right? Then create the data model for the student entity like this. For that, in the models folder, create the class name as student.cs like this. Now then, create the database context, school context class, which must be inherited from the DB context class. Remember, this DB context class is very important in Entity Framework. It does most of the internal work for you, for which you are not writing any code, like the database connection, that kind of things. Now you can think that school context is like a database, and the DB set student inside this class is like a table. Okay, so we will see the difference between DB context and DB set in upcoming question. Now in order to add data, okay, so our setup connection, data table, table DB set, the connection DB context is already. Now in order to add data to the student table, you have to use or inject that SQL context class like this in the add students method, and then you have to create the list of the students like this. In the list you can add the students, and then with the help of this for each loop and the LINQ query, you can add the items in the this students list. Okay, and finally save changes method will commit the changes and send the changes to the database. That's it. This is like the basic code structure for setting up the Entity Framework for inserting the student data in the database. That's the whole idea. What is meant by DB context and DB set? Alright, let's see the diagram. See, we have one DB context which manages the database connection with the database, and we have here multiple DB sets which represents the different tables in the database. Okay, so the definition is, DB context is a class in the Entity Framework that helps in creating the communication between the database and the domain entity classes. Okay, whereas the DB set class represent a particular entity set that can be used for create, read, update and delete operations. Okay, so particular entity set only it refers to your DB set. Okay, and here you can see the code example also. See, my DB context is inherited from DB context so that we can communicate with the database. Then here inside the constructor, we are using the connection string to set up the connection with the database. And at last, this is the DB set for customers table. If you have multiple table, then you can put multiple DB sets to represent them. Great. Now I think you know the difference between them, right? What are the different types of application development approaches used with the Entity Framework? Alright, so we have three types of approaches in Entity Framework: database first, code first and model first. Okay, so basically if you want to create one application and you want to use Entity Framework in it, so these three approaches you can follow. Out of these three you have to follow only one approach, but yes, you have these three options here. Okay, so first one is database first approach. In database first approach, first you will create the database is created and then the entity model is generated from it. Okay, so you have to create the database and then you can automatically generate the entity model with the help of Entity Framework. This is the first approach. Then in the second approach is code first approach. The code first approach involves creating the data model using the C# or VB.NET classes first. Okay, so first the model will be created. The code will be created. Developers can define entities, relationship and other schema. You will write the code, the entities, everything, and then you can generate the database schema from the code itself. Okay, so that's why we call it code first approach. Code will be created first. Then the last one is model first approach. The model first approach involves creating the data model using the visual tools. Okay, so this visual tools, okay, the diagram, drag and drop, such as entity data model designer in Visual Studio. So basically, developers can create entities, relationship, and other schema elements visually with the help of this model designer, and then you will generate the database schema from the model. So basically, visual tool will be used for the model first approach. Okay, so now it's up to you which approach is better suited. As per like I prefer database first, but code first and model first is very rarely people use, but yes, that is an option. What is the difference between LINQ to SQL and entity framework? Good question. Okay, if you see the diagram here, apart from entity framework, there is one more ORM way to connect to database in .NET, and that is LINQ to SQL. Okay, let's see what is the common thing between the LINQ to SQL and entity framework. Okay, LINQ to SQL and entity framework are both object relational ORM frameworks that allow developers to interact with the relational databases using object oriented programming techniques. Okay, clear, right? This is the common. They both are like ORM only. Now the differences are, first is LINQ to SQL is a lightweight or ORM that support only SQL Server database. Okay, this is LINQ to SQL. Whereas entity framework is a more robust ORM that support multiple database providers including SQL Server, Oracle, MySQL, etc. etc. Okay. Another difference is LINQ to SQL is suitable for small to medium sized application. Okay, because LINQ to SQL, like you have to write the queries with the LINQ direct queries. Okay, you have to in your code you have to write the like select a star from that kind of queries with LINQ to SQL. Whereas entity framework is suitable for large and complex applications, because small queries are fine with LINQ to SQL, but in large big applications you have to write big queries, right? More conditions, more joins. So for that, entity framework is better. Okay, finally, now you know the differences and you know which one you have to use in which scenarios, right?